Thank you very much. We're now going to resume the February 7th council member meeting. This is a workshop tonight, and the next item for the workshop, we have the discussion on the city's long-term budget and financial outlook. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So we have brought back workshops. This is something that we used to do years ago, where we would just provide the opportunity for the council to learn about different subject matters that we, as a city, work under, and it really is an opportunity for you to ask questions. We're not asking you to adopt a budget or anything like that, but we are going to be providing you a lot of information that we hope will help you as we move forward with the development of the city budget. So tonight we have Tiffany Allen, Deputy City Manager, who actually used to work in the Finance Department with me years ago, very knowledgeable. And we have our Finance Director, Sarah Shane, and then we have Ed Prindell, who actually is the lead on the budget development. So again, this is a very high level and introduction to the budget. Fascinating in my opinion, but I was a former finance director, and we are here to respond to any questions that you have. Thank you.
So good evening. I am Sarah Shane, the finance director, and like Maria said, with me tonight is Ed Prindell and Tiffany Allen. And tonight we will be presenting an introduction of the budget. So this workshop will cover an overview of the budget, its purpose and timeline, the various documents that guide the budget process, and the resources and expenditures included within the budget.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and Council members. Oops, thank you. Good evening, Honorable Mayor and Council members. I'm Ed Prindell. The city's budget is one of the most important documents produced and serves several purposes. First, it's a policy document. The city budget conforms to the city charter, municipal code, council and financial policies, which includes adopting a balanced budget. The adopted budget should align with the city's strategic plan and budget priorities of the city council. Second, it is a spending plan for city resources. The budget is adopted at the fund/department and category level. Chula Vista as a full-service city, which means the city provides nearly all essential services to the residents and businesses within the city. This results in a large and complicated budget, but also allows the city control over services and outcomes. Third, the city budget serves as a management and evaluation tool. We can analyze financial results by comparing budgeted revenues and expenditures against actual revenues and expenditures. Throughout the year, the budget team in the finance department monitors actual revenues and expenditures and compares to budget and provides the result via 4 quarterly monitoring reports. Fourth, the budget is also a tool for communicating with the public to inform on the city's council's visions and values, operations and services, delivery accomplishments, and key fiscal issues. Opportunities are provided for public input throughout the year, as well as via community budget workshops and the budget hearings for the proposed and adopted budget. The budget process begins in the fall with the long-term financial plan, or the 10-year forecast. This sets the stage for whether we are looking forward to growth within the budget or the need for reductions. With the change in mayor and council members this year, the long-term financial plan report was delayed to be included with the introduction to the budget. The next step is the budget development process that begins in the fall, as well as with the department's input on restructuring, position changes, and significant budget requests. 2 public workshops are held in April to present a draft of the proposed budget for public input. As required by the city charter, the city's manager proposed budget is to be submitted to the city council at least 35 days before the beginning of the fiscal year. Council will receive a proposed budget document in early May. The budget process concludes at the end of May with council's adoption of the budget. Our budget is loaded into our financial system and implemented starting on July 1st. The adopted budget book is published in July to conform with the Government Finance Officers Association standards. Once the budget is adopted, the monitoring process begins. Throughout the year, the city's budget is amended by council actions for a variety of reasons. By council policy, departments have the flexibility to transfer up to $75,000 in appropriations within a fund across budget categories without requiring council approval. These requests are administratively approved by our finance director under the city manager's delegation. This slide provides the timeline for the next steps in the budget process. Tonight, after this presentation, we'll be presenting the long-term financial plan. On February 21st, we'll be back with the fiscal year 24 second quarter financial report. There will be 2 workshops held for public input in April. The proposed budget will be presented to the council on May 9th, followed by a public hearing and budget adoption on May 23rd. Following that, Finance will be back with the fiscal year 23 third quarter budget monitoring report on June 6th and approval of the GAN limit on June 13th.
Ed, we have a question from Member Preciado about what is the GAN limit?
So the GAN limit is special legislation intended to deter jurisdictions from imposing large tax increases on taxpayers. The goal was to keep inflation adjusted per person government spending under 1978 to 79 levels. It's adjusted annually, and the City Council has to adopt the GAN limit in order for us to collect taxes. So under the direction of the city manager, the finance department develops a proposed budget which councils accept as its own. The council will have a public hearing to adopt the budget. Council could provide changes or amendments to the proposed budget for adoption at its discretion. The budget is prepared in conformance with the city charter, the municipal code, various council and financial policies, and attached to tonight's agenda, we have enclosed a copy of the applicable sections from either the from the charter, the municipal code, and council policies for reference. It must also take into account other items such as the city memorandum of understandings or labor agreements with the various labor groups. These agreements determine the personnel service expenditures, which make up a significant portion of the city's budget. Here, I wanted to mention some other considerations for our budget decision-making process. Operationally, we must adhere to fund restrictions. For instance, with endowment funds, we would only be able to spend interest earned and not the principal. For federal funds, we must follow uniform guidance and grant agreements, which are specific federal guidelines. We will address fund restrictions on the next slide. We must follow state law in our own city charter. So, for example, the state prevents us from imposing an income tax at the local level. Therefore, we cannot consider income tax as a revenue-generating option as part of the budget development process. The GAN limit is special legislation intended to deter jurisdictions from imposing large tax increases on taxpayers by establishing spending limits. There are various state propositions which limit property tax growth, tax versus charges, and etc. We also consider local measures which have budgetary impacts, such as the future sunset of Measure P, and Measure Q's limits on cannabis licenses, which limit the number of cannabis businesses in the city. At this point, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
This slide lists the types of funds for which the city sets appropriations or budgets. These types of funds are designated by accounting rules. In addition to the types of funds listed on the slide, the city does have some trust or fiduciary funds where the city acts as a trustee or agent for the parties outside of the city. Other agencies approve these budgets, and the funds are not available to the city to fund any city services. The city has over 100 funds, and each fund may have some restrictions or purposes for which these funds can be used. Governmental funds are for governmental activities supported by various governmental revenues, such as property tax, sales tax, license and permits. These include the general fund, Measure A and P sales tax funds, capital project funds, special revenue funds, which are sometimes grants, debt service funds, and then the general fund allows for discretionary use of funds. It's generally funded by taxpayer dollars, and the city has the most flexibility in the allocation of these resources. Special revenue funds are legally restricted for specific purposes. For example, we received money from the American Rescue Plan. These funds were for COVID-19, and they must follow Treasury guidelines for expenditures, particularly for procurement. And the expenditures are limited to the purposes authorized by the granting agency. Then we also have proprietary funds, which are for business-type activities, which provide goods and services to external customers. These funds are supported by user fees and include such funds as development services, our sewer services fund, and our emergency transport fund. Since these funds are supported by user fees, The revenues in the enterprise funds are limited to the purchase for which they are collected and therefore not available to fund or subsidize general fund activities. So for example, sewer funds can only be used to fund sewer-related expenditures. This next slide shows the overall city budget for fiscal year 2023, and the budget totaled $533.7 million. About half of the city's total budget is the general fund at $248 million. Additionally, we wanted to point out that this does include the capital improvements budget as well at $50.5 million. And I'll hand it back to Ed to go over revenues.
Ed, Member Preciado has another question.
In one of your slides, you, particularly the one that had the list, you indicated that Prop 218, oh, there we go. Prop 218, ensure all tax and most charges on property owners are subject to voter approval. Are our sewer fees subject to voter approval? As an example? Which are authorized under 218.
So there's a specific carve-out for property-based charges, including sewer fees. So it's not a vote of the electorate, it is a protest vote. And our city attorney, I'm sure, can.
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with this because I
Yeah.
come from a little
Water.
agency down the street.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that there's a little note on there because we will probably be dealing with sewer fees. I think that's the only one that we have under 218. Do we have others?
Trash fees are also are considered a property-based fee. And then water, but we don't do the water. And then I think the storm drain is one that there's new legislation, but I'm not sure that that has been,
And we are,
yeah.
and the council is empowered to propose, and through a protest vote, we could get rejected, but it takes 50% of the users, right? 50% plus one to reject those fees. So I just, I'm nerding out because I saw something I recognized.
Join us, we love it.
All right.
We'll nerd out with you.
Okay, Mr. Nerd, do you have any more questions?
No, not at this time.
Thank you.
Okay, so this table outlines our major revenue sources for the general fund, which makes up approximately 74.5% or $185.5 million of general fund revenues. Each revenue stream has a source of revenues listed, as well as the percentage of the total general fund revenues based on the fiscal year 23 adopted budget. As you can see, sales tax is now the biggest revenue source for the general fund, replacing the traditional leader, property tax revenues. Motor vehicle license fee is a state allocation that is tied to property tax received in lieu of vehicle registration fees. Measure A and Measure P sales tax are our district taxes, which was approved by ballot initiatives, and we'll elaborate on our sales tax items on the next slide. We also collect franchise fees, which are made up of revenues from cable providers, Republic Services, our trash provider, and SDG&E for use of public right-of-way. And TOT, which is the revenue collected on hotel, motel, and campsite rentals. So I'll highlight sales tax revenues, our current top revenue source. The city of Chula Vista has three components of sales tax: the Bradley-Burns sales tax, the Measure A sales tax, or otherwise known as our half-cent sales tax, and the Measure P sales tax, which is also a half-cent sales tax. The city contracts with our consultants, HDL, to help us track the various sales tax components. Both Measure A and Measure P sales tax revenues have both have their own funds to track expenditures. The revenues for both measures are received by the general fund, and the revenues are passed through to the respective funds via transfer out of the general fund. Measure A proceeds are intended to fund public safety staffing and services, whereas Measure P proceeds are intended to support deferred maintenance and capital needs. Both Measure A and Measure P both have citizen oversight committees that ensure compliance to their respective spending plan, documents, and provide updates to the council as well as to the public. Oh, one other mention. Finally, the collection of Measure P sales tax is set to end in 2027. Forgot to mention that, sorry. Oops. Shown in this slide are the percentage of sales tax revenues from the state and county pools compared to 10 years ago, or fiscal year 2012 versus 2022. Factors that have contributed to the increase in the county pools are the following. An ongoing shift from brick-and-mortar retail to internet purchases exacerbated by the pandemic, the Supreme Court's South Dakota versus Wayfair decision, and the state legislation AB 147, legislative change that made additional internet purchases taxable. Decrease from major retailer chain structures, resulting in a shift of revenues from pools to fulfillment centers in specific jurisdictions. And then this slide shows the per capita taxable sales by city and business groups, per capita. As you can see, Chula Vista is typically on the lower end of the sales per capita rankings, with Del Mar and Carlsbad ranking highest in the county region. Of course, Del Mar is focused on high-value tourism, and Carlsbad includes many automotive businesses. Sales tax revenues for Chula Vista is comparatively more diverse, but also concentrated in general consumer goods, followed by restaurants and hotels, and fuels and service stations. And this slide demonstrates how Measure A and P differ from the Bradley-Burns sales tax. A car buyer pays the total sales tax rate where the vehicle will be registered. If a non-Chula Vista resident were to purchase a car in a dealership within the city would receive the sales tax, or Bradley-Burns, and no district taxes for Measure A or Measure P. If a Chula Vista resident were to purchase a car in a different jurisdiction, such as National City, the city would only receive the district taxes, as the resident would still register the vehicle within the city. National City would receive the sales tax. So if a Chula Vista resident were to purchase a vehicle in a dealership within the city would receive both the sales tax as well as the district taxes, since the resident will register the vehicle within the city. Now, our second biggest revenue source is property tax. Property tax is administered by the county, and revenues stay local to county, city, special districts, and school districts. Property taxes are general fund revenues with no restrictions on the use of funds. In prior years, property tax revenues were the largest source of general fund revenues, but in recent years, we've seen sales tax grow and take over the #1 spot. Taxes are assessed at the parcel level, which is assigned a tax rate. Parcel tax rates will vary upon the jurisdiction that overlap the city. For instance, if a parcel is in a special district, it would have that tax assessment included, example for a CFD. The city receives property tax allocations monthly, the largest receipts around tax deadlines, which are November and February for homeowners. And this chart provides a sketch or an overview of the county's property tax allocations in fiscal year 22. As you can see, most property taxes go to schools. In the county, cities in the county were allocated about 12.5% of the property tax roll in general. Property tax is assessed on secured property, real property or land, unsecured property, and utility property. Several pieces of legislation impacts the city's property tax generation, to mention a few. Proposition 13 limits tax to 1% of the assessed value of property with a maximum increase of 2% or annual CPI. Assembly Bill 8 designates the city shares of the 1% general property tax is based on property tax levied in 1970s. Receive what you got prior years plus the changes in current years for growth within our jurisdiction. As a result of growth, local government AB 8 or Assembly Bill 8 shares can change slightly year to year depending on how much population growth local governments receive relative to others in the county. Now we'll take an overview of the general fund expenditures. This slide provides a breakdown of the general fund expenses. As you can see, personnel services, which includes retirement and health benefits, is the largest expenditures, accounting for 76% of the total fiscal year 23 adopted budget for the general fund. Supplies and services is the next largest category, consuming 12% of the general fund budget, and utilities and other expenses at 4%. Transfers are excluded from this chart to reflect the true operating expenditures and will be discussed later in this presentation. Now, this slide provides a breakdown of general fund expenditures by operating department. Public safety, which includes both police and fire departments, represent the largest piece of the general fund pie. Combined, they are $85.5 million, or 53% for the general fund. The next largest department is the Public Works Department. Now, this slide represents the impact of the net cost by department. And there are some revenues that are generated by general fund expenditures, and without those expenditures, the revenues would not exist. Some examples are fire department strike team revenues, park and recreation rental fees and classes. Another example is specific expenditures tied to the city's maintenance of effort in order to qualify for Transnet funding to maintain our streets and roadways. This slide represents the expenditures that the city incurs that do not have specific revenues to fund them and are therefore funded by the major discretionary revenues such as property tax and sales tax. If the city is faced with a recession or the ongoing expenditures exceed the ongoing revenues, meaning that we do not have a balanced budget, these expenditures are where the city would need to look for reductions. As you can see, public safety's full expenditures from the previous slides were $85.5 million. With the net expenditures, after taking into account revenues generated by police and fire, lands at $64.8 million. As you can see, some departments such as engineering and capital projects are fully funded by non-discretionary revenues, so cuts to the departments will result in a likely cut to revenues, which will not result in a decrease to any budgetary gaps.
I want to cover this a little bit before you move on.
Yes.
Just because this slide is something that I want you to understand as a city council if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're having to make budgetary cuts. So what this here shows is the budgetary expenses net of any revenues that are being generated by that department. And the reason that's important is if we come to you with a budget and we say we have to cut $2 million out of the general fund budget, we're not going to present to you a budget cut that is revenue offset because they are not gaining any ground. You would never cut a revenue offset program. So what we're showing you here is essentially what makes up a department net of any revenues that they generate. So if we're looking at making reductions of $2 million, it could be pretty dramatic if your priority is to protect public safety, of course. It could be decimating to a department's operating budget. So I just want to, and this is one slide that I think we need to share with you even further because this is a very important slide for you to understand. Because if you just look at the budget document, you just look at expenses, it makes it seem like Public Works has a lot of money where you can just make reductions when it really doesn't, because it has capital projects that are being funded through other resources. So I really just want to spend a little bit of time on this chart with you. Luckily, we haven't had to go through that process in many years, and hopefully in the future you don't have to deal with that, but if we do, this is a chart that I think you really have to understand when you make those decisions. Thank you.
The city attorney budget looks extremely overstated.
Well, that would be the first place we would recommend making cuts, but we don't need to go through that tonight.
So you said $2 million, right?
Yeah, 2.4, no, I'm just kidding.
It's just going to get worse as my last day gets closer, I have a feeling.
Oh, you don't even know.
This is the polite version.
Okay, thank you for those comments. Go ahead and back to the presentation.
So this slide represents our personnel services. Oh,
I'm going to recognize Member Gonzalez.
Just want to test out my microphone, thank you. But I did appreciate that chart. I am a big fan of it, and as I perused the background material, noticed that a lot of the material that we're seeing today, we weren't privy to in advance. Do we get a copy of this whole presentation afterwards? Perfect. Music to my ears. Thank you.
And there will be a quiz next month.
So this slide represents our personnel services, by far the city's biggest expense category, accounting for 76% of general fund expenses for fiscal year 2023. Costs are driven by labor agreements with city bargaining groups. Besides wage increases, healthcare costs are an area where we see growth. Pension costs are also significant as we add additional staff, weather the markets, and CalPERS actuarial assumption changes. We also factor in vacancies/salary savings as a negative expense to essentially take into account that we cannot realistically achieve a 0% vacancy rate. Historically, we have budgeted this at around 2%. We will discuss this further in the presentation on the long-term financial plan. Supplies and services include all of our contracts with professional services, office supplies, program supplies, and within the last year, we have seen an inflationary impact in this category. We have also had supply chain disruptions, especially in securing new vehicles. With utilities, we have seen recent substantial rate increases for water, gas, electricity, and the city's public works is working on our solar generation to assure that we see some cost-saving measures in future years. We also have to consider, as the city continues to build out, we will also see increased utility costs for new city parks, fire stations, and other facilities. At this point, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
So this slide covers the various city reserves. And, pre the Great Recession, the city had very minimal reserves. But in 2009, the policy was updated from a target of 8% of general fund operating expenses to a target of 15% of general fund operating expenses. And we currently have 5 major reserves in place. The general fund reserve policy was established to ensure that the city's finances are managed in a manner which will continue to provide for the delivery of quality services, maintain and enhance service delivery as the community grows in accordance with the general plan, minimize or eliminate the need to raise taxes and fees because of temporary revenue shortfalls, and establish the reserves necessary to meet known and unknown future obligations, and the ability to respond to unexpected opportunities.
Sarah, we have a question from member Pierciato.
Are these operational reserves? I mean, are they part of our cash flow, or are they just banked in a bucket of sorts?
So the general fund operating reserve is 15% of the next year's general fund operating expenditures. So at the end of fiscal year 22, we looked at what 23's budget was, took 15% of those operating expenditures, and ensured that we had 15% set aside in the general fund coffers. So we've got 15% of that set aside at the end of 2022, which is $27 million. And then we have an additional 5% set aside for the economic contingency reserve. We currently have the catastrophic event reserve funded at 1.5% of the 3%. And we are setting aside in the pension and other post-employment benefits reserve. That's mostly funded by 75% of any general fund surplus that exists at the end of the year. Just like all of the reserves that are currently funded, they've all been funded by general fund surpluses that have occurred throughout the years. We don't budget the reserves currently. We wanted to make sure that we weren't taking any funds off the table, but they have been grown over the years, basically just from general fund surpluses that have occurred. So when the POBs were issued, we put into place another pension reserve fund that is setting aside 75% of that general fund surplus to this pension reserve. And the goal for that reserve is to be equivalent to the general fund operating reserve, or 15% of the next year's operating expenses.
So I'm going to follow up. So just to clarify my understanding, so I understand how you come up with a number. What I don't understand is if the number is banked separately, or if it's just part of the cash flow and you need it for cash flow. The reason for that is even when you have reserves, if they're static, you have chances to do one-time investments, and then, or because you're replacing, or you have a sinking fund or something like that.
They're currently residing within the general fund. They're not set aside in a separate fund, but they are invested. The cash is invested with all of the other cash of the city. We have a very robust investment policy that dictates everything that we can invest in, and that is included within that. So, I mean, the cash of the city is one big pool, right? And it's all available, and it's all invested at the same time, so.
And I apologize, I know language from other places, so I will eventually catch up and learn our language, so.
So just to add to that, as staff presented earlier, homeowners pay property taxes twice a year.
Right.
So our big influx of revenue or cash comes in twice a year. So you will have points in time where this fluctuates. This is a point in time at the end of the year, the end of the fiscal year. Just wanted to point that out.
Great.
Thank you very much. You can proceed with the presentation.
Sure. So this next slide shows the ramp up. Probably should have showed some of the earlier years maybe. But you can see that as of FY18, we achieved the 15% and we've maintained the 15%. We intend to maintain that for the foreseeable future. We've also hit our economic contingency, sorry, I get confused between the catastrophic and the economic. We've also achieved that, so we plan on maintaining that as well. And then the next goal is to increase the pension reserve fund as well as the catastrophic event reserve, so.
Yeah, I would just mention that it would be good to show prior years, because the city staff, council did a lot of heavy lifting to be able to get to those reserves, because we never know when the next recession is going to hit, and especially with the state at being a $25 billion deficit now. Many times the state, when it has a budget deficit, it goes ahead and balances its budget on the backs of municipalities like us. And so I think this has been a great story, how we've been able to get up to fully funded reserves. Thank you.
Sure. So in recent years, the city had a large unfunded accrued liability to CalPERS retirement system. And to tackle the city's growing pension liability and shortfall of assets to pay the pension obligations to council, in February of 2021, the city issued a 24-year pension obligation bond of approximately $355 million to pay off the UAL as of June 30th of 2019. These pension obligation bonds were issued at a low interest rate of 2.54%. When evaluated against the 6.8% cost of CalPERS, creates a very significant interest expense savings. So this chart is just kind of a visual of what I just talked about. We issued the POBs in February 21, and the black bars are representing our very stable and even debt service payments that are happening over the next 24 years. And the kind of bluish gray line that's kind of zigzagging across the top is what we were estimated to have paid had we not issued the POBs. That's what we would have estimated to pay to CalPERS. The space in between is essentially the savings that has been created by issuing this POBs, which is currently estimated by the last analysis that GovInvest did for us to be approximately $200 million. And so again, 75% of that savings, in addition to the debt service that has stabilized the amount we're paying for the UAL, 75% of the savings that's being generated by the debt issuance is being set aside in a Section 115 trust fund, which is earmarked to pay off a portion of the POB at the 10-year mark, as well as any UAL that may arise over the next 24-year period. So one other thing we wanted to discuss is just operating budget versus capital budget. So the city's operating budget is for day-to-day costs of providing municipal services such as staffing, supplies, and contracted services. And the city's budget's ongoing expenditures to be equal to ongoing expected revenues. Generally, the policy is to only utilize one-time revenues to fund one-time expenditures, not ongoing expenditures, meaning that a windfall or a one-time receipt of revenues will not fund costs that will continue year after year when those one-time revenues are not expected to be received again. The capital improvements budget involves the procurement, construction, or installation of facilities or related equipment which improves, preserves, enhances, or modernizes the city's provision of municipal services. By definition, these projects include items which have a useful life of at least 5 years and cost in excess of $50,000. Since the capital budget is for long-term capital improvements, facilities, and equipment, the revenues are collected over time, and capital programs generally extend beyond a single fiscal year, and because of this, capital budgets often include expenditures funded by both current year revenues and funds that have been previously allocated. So some of the sources for our CIP projects for fiscal 21 through 23 have been the American Rescue Plan. We have a Capital Improvements Project Fund, as well as the State Gas Tax, Road Maintenance and Rehabilitation, Measure P, the Sewer Facility Replacement Fund, and Transnet, or the County Sales Tax. Generally, the city's general fund has not been a resource for the CIP project as alternative fundings have been available. The uses for this, the things that we're spending those monies on, the types of projects we're doing are the buildings, the drainage, general government, parks, and roadway. And this table shows the breakdown of those. Buildings and roadways were almost 76% of the city's CIP in '23, but it's important to note that this is not typical. Roadway projects are usually the biggest category for the annual CIP budget, but during fiscal year '22 and '23, the building category was increased due to the Loma Verde project, which was about $15 million in '22 and an additional $14 million in fiscal year '23. So as Ed mentioned in the beginning, after the budget process is complete and the budget is adopted, the budget monitoring process begins. And the Finance Department provides 4 quarterly reports to the council per year. These reports provide the latest information available for the anticipated revenue and expenditures of the general fund and other budgeted funds of the city. They're also the mechanism to request any necessary budget adjustments. So any amendments to the budget require a 4/5 vote of the council. These can include new grants that are new to the year, movement between categories, or overall increases to appropriations for uses of available revenue or fund balance. And as Ed mentioned, by council policy, departments do have the flexibility to transfer up to $75,000 in appropriations within a fund across budget categories such as supplies and services to personnel without requiring the council approval, and these are approved administratively by the finance director under the city manager's delegation. So this is,
Real quick. Go back to the last slide. So after the council adopts the budget, there is quite a bit of work that happens after that. It doesn't stop. So, you know, the quarterly reports that come to you, there's a lot of information with changes and projections because we don't know we can't predict the future. So I did want to acknowledge the finance department. They put a lot of work in keeping this budget balanced and have done so for several years, which is the reason you've seen those reserves grow over time. So one of the things I just request the council to make sure they pay attention to are those quarterly reports, because they do give you the best indication of where we're headed financially. And the economy right now, no one's really certain where we're headed, so we're just going to be bringing those to you with the, hopefully, news that we're continuing to stay balanced, but if we're not, then what we do is we come to you with recommendations on what we need to do to keep it balanced.
and this is just a recap of the process. So once this introduction to the budget presentation is completed, we'll be moving into the long-term financial plan. That's the other item for tonight. And then on February 21st, we'll be back with the 2023 second quarter financial report. And then we'll move into the budget process with the 2 community workshops. We'll present the proposed budget on the 9th of May, and then the 23rd will be the public hearing. We'll come back with the third quarter financial report, and then finish it up with the CAN 11 approval.
Great. I have a question from Member Preciado.
What are the taxes you didn't introduce in your initial presentation, but I'm sure I'm not waiting for the slide, I guess, is TOT.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons I'm very interested in TOT is we get a little bigger share of the tax, right, that we collect through this is the hotel tax,
Right.
so-called hotel tax. And I'm just wondering if we have, if your long-term will project what might happen or what might occur. I do obviously want to recognize that, for example, the RETA project or the Bayfront project, it's contained. I mean, it's financing the project, but are there TOT budgets, the TOT from other venues, do they contribute to our tax base? Because I'm wondering if it's the same 1% or if it's a higher number.
The TOT tax is 10%. And then within the Bayfront area specifically, there's an additional 5.5% special tax.
So every time we see a hotel go up, or we see high occupancy, that is a different kind of sales tax that we collect that really benefits us.
Well, it's not sale, it's another tax, it's transient occupancy tax. It's 10% of the room rate that we collect. It's due at the end of every month, in arrears for them to collect it. So yes, when you do see a new hotel go up, that is additional revenue to the city.
And are we tracking that separately from the regular general? Because it goes to general fund too, or is it?
Yeah, it goes to the general fund too. The extra 5.5% that's in the special district for the Bayfront does not go to the general fund. It goes to its own fund for its own specific purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the Member Preciado, very good question. The transit occupancy tax is a significant tax because the revenue actually goes to the city. On your sales tax and other taxes, it goes to other places. So your sales tax goes to Sacramento. And what does Sacramento do with it? It distributes it to all these other different places where the TOT tax, the transit occupancy tax, is substantially for the city of Chula Vista. And we've been very successful at opening the Residence Inn, the Ayers Hotel, and the Hampton Inn Homewood Suites, and those all bring in substantial revenue for our city. And those are very positive amenities because they allow residents to come to the city, but they also provide that additional revenue to the city of.
I'm very happy that it goes somewhere else. I work for a public university funded by that sales tax.
But you can't have our TOT tax, right?
No, I don't want that.
Mr. Member Gonzalez.
Thank you. The slide changed from the budget timeline, but my question was, somewhere in that process, is there opportunity for the department heads, whether it's solicited or they go ahead and proactively give input on the proposed budget for the following fiscal year, whether that's written or verbally, formally, or informally? And are we privy to that as a council?
So my responsibility as the city manager is to bring forward to you a balanced budget. So what I will prepare is the city manager proposed budget. My message to the department heads this year has been hold the line, which means they will be submitting millions of dollars in requests anyways, because there's always a lot of need. And I will sort through all those requests and identify the things that are the most critical and then have to make some recommendations. But what you will be seeing is a balanced budget. But what would be helpful tonight is if there's some input that the council would like to provide me tonight in terms of projects or things that you would like to see if there's an opportunity to consider those as we're developing the budget, because it will go up and down. You know, you'll see some numbers today in terms of where we're at with the budget today, but as projections come in, we get a more updated information from the county or our sales tax consultant, then have an opportunity to consider what we can bring forward with the goal of not impacting our service levels and not laying off employees.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that point? So I have utmost respect for the finance department, the work that you do, the professionalism in this presentation, how polished it is, and how much the budget reflects best practices year in and year out. And that starts at the top with the city manager, of course. I would just make the point that what I miss a bit is the messiness of it, the back and forth of a little bit of alternatives or even dissent. I do like that we have the 2 public hearings coming up in April. But as far as stakeholders are concerned, it's not just the public, not just the members of the public. Hopefully, we also have the opportunity for them to provide written comments, et cetera. So one of the things that I would love to just put out there that I would love to see, and perhaps you would be open to carving out a position, because outside of hearing from stakeholders, the only other way that I see the opportunity to hear dissenting opinions that we don't invent as council members or relay from our constituents is having a budget analyst that answers directly to the council. So I would just mention that one of my priorities in the budget would be considering carving out somebody who has budget experience. You know, a top deputy manager would be awesome, but that's not realistic, but neither would we be content with a unpaid intern. So maybe somewhere in between, somebody that really has budget experience and could assist the council in taking a look, analyzing and commenting on the budget, I think is something that I would love to see and I hope would be considered.
So in terms
Okay. Member Preciado, go
So
ahead.
just in terms of process, let's say all of us are creative that way,
So, again, we can have that conversation now. If the council has any proposals that they'd like to consider, you could provide that. I think it needs to be in the public setting, because otherwise I'll get 25, maybe individual requests coming at me, and I really don't know what the priorities of the council will be. So I think this is part of the process where we can get some input.
Go ahead, do you still have a
No,
question?
I'll finalize. So after we get the long-term financial plan, because that'll help us open our eyes to
Yeah.
the budget and where it is, I'm interested in offering a small proposal, in my view, for people to consider. And if we have another meeting in the future, maybe next month, where we have this space, that might be where other members of council might be inspired, like as Councilman Gonzalez just did, with ideas. But yeah, so I look forward to seeing the long-term projection. I would have a small proposal to see, and we'll seek support to see if it can be considered.
You have another comment?
Yes. Just in line with the solicitation for priorities, I'll mention, and this is a bit speaking out of school because I haven't been briefed, and I'm not up to date with the conversations about the police substation that's been talked about and may be considered on the east side of Chula Vista. That would certainly make it on my list of top priorities, as well as making sure that the SDSU actually happens. What would hopefully be just the first step of a growing partnership with the SDSU over in the Millennium Project, making sure that that moves forward as well. But those are just preliminary comments today. Look forward to learning more about.
Okay, let's go ahead and continue with the presentation. Do we have any more?
That concludes the budget introduction presentation. So
Great.
can
Do
move
we
into
have
the
any-
long-term financial
We're
plan.
going to
If
talk
there's no
about the
more
long-term
questions.
financial plan now.
Yeah, before we move into that, do we have any speakers from the public?
I believe we do have one speaker, but I think they have another portion to the presentation.
Okay, well, let's
This
move
item?
into the long-term financial plan then.
It's at the end of